He thought she was just a nanny, until he saw her dancing with his daughter in a wheelchair. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. Morning came with its usual precision over the estate, sunlight spilling in through the high windows as if summoned by command. The Whitmore residence, perched on a hill in the green quiet of Connecticut, looked like something out of a brochure for the perfect life. White stone, steel gates, acres of lawn cropped down to obedience. Every surface gleamed, from the glass-paneled walls to the marble driveway. It was a house without shadows, and yet somehow without warmth. Inside, the silence pressed harder. Grayson Whitmore sat at the breakfast table, a man carved from glass himself, impeccably tailored in a slate-gray suit, his tie pinned with a small silver bar. The coffee in front of him was untouched. Beside it lay a tablet blinking with market alerts, though he hadn't swiped it awake. His posture was straight, his eyes distant, staring not at the food, not at the screen, but at the chair across from him, empty like it always was. He had learned to live with absences, the absence of conversation, the absence of noise, the absence of her. Elise had died 3 years ago on a rainy Thursday. A truck driver had lost control of his rig on a slick curve, and the rest had unraveled quickly. Headlights, screaming tires, glass everywhere, a phone call that had shattered his life into a silence that never lifted. She was gone instantly. Their daughter, Emma, had survived, but not whole. The spinal injury had been unforgiving. She'd woken up without the use of her legs and hadn't spoken since. Grayson didn't believe in miracles. He believed in investments, projections, leverage. Nothing in the past 3 years had proven otherwise. His daughter sat in the sunroom, just beyond the wide arch of the kitchen entry. The wheelchair she used was custom, expensive, matte black with reinforced supports. She was still in her nightgown, a pale blue thing with tiny embroidered daisies. Her legs rested motionless, tucked neatly on the footplate. She stared out the window at nothing in particular, her head slightly tilted, her expression unreadable. Grayson had watched her sit like that for hundreds of mornings. Not once had she turned toward him. He rose slowly, leaving the coffee and the cold breakfast behind, and stepped toward her. His leather shoes made no sound on the imported tile. He paused a few feet away, unsure whether to speak. What would be the point? His phone buzzed in his pocket, an insistent vibration that begged to be answered. He ignored it. 3 weeks ago, he had hired another therapist, a woman from Boston with credentials stacked higher than his wine cellar. She had lasted 12 days. Emma needs a different approach, she'd said, with the gentle detachment that professionals like to wear when things fell apart. She doesn't respond. It's like she's not there. Grayson had simply nodded and signed the check. He'd grown accustomed to those parting lines. She's not there. Nothing we can do. Some children just shut down. They always left out the word broken, but it hung in the air anyway. At first, he had thrown money at the problem. Custom rehabilitation suites built into the East Wing, a rotating team of pediatric specialists, neurologists, speech pathologists. The house had been full of people in lab coats and measured voices. Emma hadn't spoken to any of them. She hadn't spoken to him either. Grayson had spent those years building walls, professional ones, psychological ones, ones that looked like routines and policies. He was never late to a meeting. He ate the same breakfast every day. He answered emails within 7 minutes. It kept the grief at bay. It made him feel like something was still under control, until the stillness started to feel heavier than grief itself. Emma's presence was ghost-like, not because she lacked life, but because her silence illuminated everything else that was missing. There was no laughter, no bedtime stories, no pleading for more dessert, just quiet. A soft, stifling kind of quiet that made the house feel like a mausoleum. He walked to her slowly, crouching down so their eyes could meet, if she would meet them. "Morning, baby," he said, his voice rougher than intended. She didn't flinch. Her eyes blinked at a sluggish pace. Her hands were in her lap, fingers slightly curled as if holding something invisible. He touched her hand gently. "You sleep okay?" Still nothing. Grayson swallowed the ache. Every morning was the same, and yet it always felt like a new kind of failure. He stood and turned toward the kitchen. Somewhere, deep in the west wing, the intercom buzzed again. The head of household staff requesting a word, probably about the landscapers or the new shipment of linens. He didn't care. When Elise had been alive, there had been color. He thought she was just a nanny, until he saw her dancing with his daughter in a wheelchair. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. Morning came with its usual precision over the estate, sunlight spilling in through the high windows as if summoned by command. The Whitmore residence, perched on a hill in the green quiet of Connecticut, looked like something out of a brochure for the perfect life. White stone, steel gates, acres of lawn cropped down to obedience. Every surface gleamed, from the glass-paneled walls to the marble driveway. It was a house without shadows, and yet somehow without warmth. Inside, the silence pressed harder. Grayson Whitmore sat at the breakfast table, a man carved from glass himself, impeccably tailored in a slate-gray suit, his tie pinned with a small silver bar. The coffee in front of him was untouched. Beside it lay a tablet blinking with market alerts, though he hadn't swiped it awake. His posture was straight, his eyes distant, staring not at the food, not at the screen, but at the chair across from him, empty like it always was. He had learned to live with absences, the absence of conversation, the absence of noise, the absence of her. Elise had died 3 years ago on a rainy Thursday. A truck driver had lost control of his rig on a slick curve, and the rest had unraveled quickly. Headlights, screaming tires, glass everywhere, a phone call that had shattered his life into a silence that never lifted. She was gone instantly. Their daughter, Emma, had survived, but not whole. The spinal injury had been unforgiving. She'd woken up without the use of her legs and hadn't spoken since. Grayson didn't believe in miracles. He believed in investments, projections, leverage. Nothing in the past 3 years had proven otherwise. His daughter sat in the sunroom, just beyond the wide arch of the kitchen entry. The wheelchair she used was custom, expensive, matte black with reinforced supports. She was still in her nightgown, a pale blue thing with tiny embroidered daisies. Her legs rested motionless, tucked neatly on the footplate. She stared out the window at nothing in particular, her head slightly tilted, her expression unreadable. Grayson had watched her sit like that for hundreds of mornings. Not once had she turned toward him. He rose slowly, leaving the coffee and the cold breakfast behind, and stepped toward her. His leather shoes made no sound on the imported tile. He paused a few feet away, unsure whether to speak. What would be the point? His phone buzzed in his pocket, an insistent vibration that begged to be answered. He ignored it. 3 weeks ago, he had hired another therapist, a woman from Boston with credentials stacked higher than his wine cellar. She had lasted 12 days. "Emma needs a different approach," she'd said, with the gentle detachment that professionals like to wear when things fell apart. "She doesn't respond. It's like she's not there." Grayson had simply nodded and signed the check. He'd grown accustomed to those parting lines. She's not there. Nothing we can do. Some children just shut down. They always left out the word broken, but it hung in the air anyway. At first, he had thrown money at the problem. Custom rehabilitation suites built into the East Wing, a rotating team of pediatric specialists, neurologists, speech pathologists. The house had been full of people in lab coats and measured voices. Emma hadn't spoken to any of them. She hadn't spoken to him either. Grayson had spent those years building walls, professional ones, psychological ones, ones that looked like routines and policies. He was never late to a meeting. He ate the same breakfast every day. He answered emails within 7 minutes. It kept the grief at bay. It made him feel like something was still under control, until the stillness started to feel heavier than grief itself. Emma's presence was ghost-like, not because she lacked life, but because her silence illuminated everything else that was missing. There was no laughter, no bedtime stories, no pleading for more dessert, just quiet. A soft, stifling kind of quiet that made the house feel like a mausoleum. He walked to her slowly, crouching down so their eyes could meet, if she would meet them. "Morning, baby," he said, his voice rougher than intended. She didn't flinch. Her eyes blinked at a sluggish pace. Her hands were in her lap, fingers slightly curled as if holding something invisible. He touched her hand gently. "You sleep okay?" Still nothing. Grayson swallowed the ache. Every morning was the same, and yet it always felt like a new kind of failure. He stood and turned toward the kitchen. Somewhere, deep in the West Wing, the intercom buzzed again. The head of household staff requesting a word, probably about the landscapers or the new shipment of linens. He didn't care. When Elise had been alive, there had been color. The girl had not spoken, not moved with purpose, not truly looked at anyone for as long as Grayson could remember. She simply existed in the same spaces others moved through, like a shadow painted into the background. Malin entered the room without fanfare. She didn't greet Emma aloud, didn't approach her with the wide, cheerful voices that past caregivers often adopted, as if louder smiles could somehow awaken a child from silence. Instead, she placed her tote gently on the windowsill, sat down in the same chair as before, and began to hum again. A different tune this time, slower, more tender. Her voice wasn't trained, but there was honesty in the way it trembled, unforced. Grayson, listening from the hallway upstairs, closed his eyes. Later, he would question himself. Why didn't he leave? Why didn't he return to his office and ignore it all like he had promised? But something held him there. Something in that unremarkable melody, in the way it filled the air not with demands, but with presence. Malin didn't speak to Emma. She sang to the room. She let the notes linger in the space between them and fall where they may. And when the song ended, she unpacked nothing except a square of blue fabric, soft and sheer like a dancer's scarf. She let it fall across her knees, then lifted it gently and let it flutter through the air like a lazy butterfly. Emma didn't move. But her eyes followed. It was subtle, a flicker of awareness, the kind of change that wouldn't register on a medical chart or satisfy a clinician. But Malin saw it. She didn't point it out, didn't gasp or praise or celebrate. She simply kept moving the scarf, letting it ripple and float. She hummed again. Grayson didn't realize he'd leaned forward until his foot shifted and the floorboard creaked. Malin didn't look up, but Emma blinked. Once, slowly. That was the first morning the silence felt different. Over the next few days, Malin returned each morning with her tote, her scarf, her songs. She brought no clinical tools, no flashcards, no binders. She didn't measure progress with charts. She brought rhythm. She brought steadiness. She brought presence. And for a house so filled with the weight of wealth and the sterility of routine, it was more foreign than any medical equipment ever had been. The staff at first remained polite but skeptical. The head chef asked quietly whether she needed any special dietary considerations. The housekeeper wondered aloud to Margaret if it was appropriate to have a cleaner in the sunroom. And the family physician, who visited once a week like a clockmaker inspecting broken parts, raised an eyebrow when he saw her sitting beside Emma with a scarf draped over her lap. "Is this the new therapist?" he asked, glancing at Grayson. "No," Grayson answered curtly. "She's the nanny." The doctor didn't argue, but his silence said enough. Malin never seemed to notice the disapproval, or perhaps she did and simply didn't care. She treated the house like a place that could be softened. She rearranged the sunroom furniture slightly to make space for movement. She placed a small basket of soft toys and fabrics near Emma's chair. Not gaudy, not stimulating in the clinical sense, just familiar textures. She tuned the old radio in the hallway to a classical station and left it at low volume. And always, always she hummed. Emma, for her part, remained still. But something about the stillness changed. She no longer seemed lost inside it. She seemed to choose it, to observe from within it. Occasionally, she blinked more quickly when the music changed. Once, she lifted a finger slightly when Malin passed the scarf close to her lap. It was nothing. And yet, it was everything. Grayson began watching more often. From the hallway, from the edge of his study, he never entered the room, never spoke, but his presence, invisible though it was, became part of the daily ritual. Every afternoon he checked the security cameras in the sunroom, not out of suspicion, but something closer to yearning. He didn't know how to explain it. He just needed to know that someone was still trying. One evening, long after Malin had left and the house had returned to its usual muted routine, Grayson found himself standing in front of Elisa's old bookshelf. It had been untouched since her death. The books had gathered a light sheen of dust. She had always loved reading poetry, Rilke, Neruda, Dickinson. He remembered teasing her for the way she would whisper lines under her breath when she cooked. He reached for a slim volume, one of her favorites. It fell open to a page she had dog-eared. The ink was faded, but her handwriting was still there in the margin. A simple note. She feels more than she says. Grayson sat down on the floor and stayed there until morning. The next day, when Malin arrived, he nodded to her from the staircase. She nodded back. That was the first time they acknowledged each other. Emma was wearing a pale pink dress that day. Her hair had been braided carefully, one loose curl slipping down her cheek. She sat in her usual spot, but when Malin entered the room, something shifted. Emma turned her head. Only slightly, just enough to follow the motion of the scarf Malin held. The scarf floated, and Emma's eyes followed. Not for long, not with certainty, but they followed. Malin didn't speak. She didn't celebrate. She simply kept moving. In the kitchen, Margaret poured 2 cups of tea and placed them on the table. Grayson joined her, unusually silent. The housekeeper studied him for a moment, then said gently, "She's not like the others." "I noticed," he said. "She's not trying to fix Emma." "She should be." Margaret hesitated. "What if she's just giving her a reason to come back?" Grayson didn't answer. But that night, when he passed Emma's room, he paused. The radio was playing faintly, an old lullaby he hadn't heard in years, the same one Elise used to sing when rocking Emma to sleep. Malin wasn't in the room. She had gone home, but the music lingered. Emma's eyes were closed, her head tilted toward the sound. Grayson stood in the doorway for a long time, and when he finally turned away, his hand trembled on the doorknob. He didn't believe in ghosts, but something of Elise was still in that melody. And something in his daughter, after all this time, had finally listened. He went to bed that night without opening his laptop. The markets could wait. Something more important had begun. Not loudly, not with fireworks or revelations, but with a song, and a scarf, and a woman who simply refused to walk away. In the house that had forgotten how to breathe, someone had remembered how to hum. Spring crept in with subtlety, warming the marble floors of the Whitmore estate with patches of sunlight that danced quietly across the surface like passing spirits. The rain had retreated, but the world outside remained cautious, as if not entirely sure it could trust the warmth to last. Inside, things were changing too, slowly, carefully, almost imperceptibly, like the gentle tilting of a compass needle. Malin continued to arrive each morning at the same time, always in quiet shoes, always with her humble canvas tote. Grayson had stopped asking about her schedule, though he was always somehow aware of her presence. She no longer felt like a visitor in the house. She occupied space differently now, not as a guest or an employee, but as someone who belonged, not because of status or salary, but because her presence mattered. The staff, initially skeptical, had grown accustomed to a rhythm. Margaret, in particular, watched her with something approaching reverence. Every morning, Emma was wheeled into the sunroom where Malin would be waiting. The arrangement had become so natural that no one thought to question it anymore. The child's expressions remained minimal, but those who paid attention, who really looked, began to notice the shifts. Her eyes stayed open longer now. She followed movements with a steadiness that had not existed even weeks before. Her fingers, once curled tight against her palms, now occasionally unfurled with effort. Malin never reacted with fanfare. There were no declarations of progress, no charts drawn, no milestones marked in celebratory tones. She simply took note and adapted. The music she chose shifted with Emma's attention. When Emma's eyes lingered longer on a fluttering scarf, Malin would repeat the motion again and again until it felt like a conversation. The scarf dances became routine. Malin introduced new textures, a piece of velvet, a long strip of satin, once even a feathered fan. She let Emma watch, never forcing the objects into her hands, but allowing the temptation of sensation to rest close enough to reach. It was during one of those sessions that Emma's hand, seemingly of its own volition, reached out and brushed the corner of a drifting ribbon. Malin didn't say a word. She didn't even pause. She simply continued the movement, the rhythm, the invitation. Grayson, who had watched from the far doorway, felt something uncoil inside his chest. It was such a small thing. So small it could have been missed, forgotten. But he had seen it. Her hand. Moving. Later that day, he found himself standing outside Elisa's music room, a space he hadn't entered since the accident. The grand piano inside sat untouched beneath a linen cover. Dust had settled in the folds like regret. He placed his hand on the doorframe and stared inside, overwhelmed not by memories, but by the contrast. Elise had always filled the house with sound. Her laughter, her playing, her insistence that Emma's world should be filled with melody even before she could speak. He closed the door without entering. He wasn't ready, but he no longer turned away from the sound of music in his home. That, at least, was new. One morning, Malin brought a small speaker and placed it on the windowsill. From it came the soft tones of a string quartet, a lullaby she'd loved as a child. As the violins played, she gently laid down a mat near Emma's chair and began to stretch her arms in slow, deliberate arcs. Her movements were elegant in their simplicity. She never left the ground, never tried to impress or perform. It was more communion than choreography, a dialogue of bodies and space and presence. Emma's gaze tracked her for the entirety of the session. That night, Grayson sat at his desk and did not open his laptop. He reached for a leather-bound journal and wrote a single sentence. She followed. The next day, Malin entered the sunroom to find Emma awake, her eyes open and bright. The child's expression was neutral, but her posture had changed. She was sitting more upright, her hands resting gently on the armrests of her chair rather than folded tightly into her lap. Malin said nothing. She smiled, walked to her usual chair, and sat down. Then she began to hum. The song was unfamiliar to Grayson, who stood at the doorway, but the tone was rich and sorrowful. An old gospel tune, perhaps, something passed from one generation of women to the next. As she hummed, she folded a piece of cloth into the shape of a bird, then let it glide from her hand to the floor like a creature set free. Emma's eyes followed its flight. Grayson stepped inside the room for the first time. He walked to the edge of the mat, knelt beside his daughter, and looked into her face. For a moment, she looked back. It was not direct. It was not a gaze held in full awareness. But her eyes found his, and they stayed. He exhaled a sound between a sob and a laugh. "Hi, baby," he said. Emma blinked. Malin, watching from her place, did not interrupt. She did not frame the moment in importance or insert herself into it. She simply let it be. That night, Grayson stood outside the nursery. The door was ajar. He watched as Malin sang softly while brushing Emma's hair, the same lullaby Elise used to sing. The room, once a sterile space of monitors and routines, now glowed with warmth. Soft, fairy lights strung above the bed cast golden shadows across the walls. Emma's eyes fluttered as she listened. Her body relaxed. Her breathing slowed. Grayson leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a stranger in his own home. It was Malin who transformed the structure into shelter, not by force, not by demand, but by the consistent offering of presence. She never demanded that Emma participate, but she made her feel welcome in the moment. Every day, every hour. She waited for the child to choose. One afternoon, Emma reached out her hand, fully extended, and touched the scarf before Malin had offered it. It was deliberate. Grayson saw it from his office monitor. He stood up, stunned. He walked to the sunroom with measured steps, opened the door, and simply stood in the doorway. Emma didn't flinch. She held the scarf, her fingers curled around it, thin and fragile but intentional. Malin said softly, "You like this one?" Emma did not speak, but she blinked once and then twice. Her grip on the scarf tightened. Grayson walked over and knelt beside her again. "Can I see too?" he asked. Emma turned toward him. No smile, no words, but she turned. That night, Grayson made a quiet decision. He asked Margaret to remove the medical equipment from Emma's room, the stand and frame, the adjustable hospital bed, the noisy oxygen monitor that had never once been used. He told her to replace them with soft lighting, soft colors, and space. Space for movement, space for change, space for life. In the days that followed, Malin introduced new routines. She brought small instruments, a bell, a hand drum, a wooden block. She never placed them in Emma's hands, she simply let them exist nearby. Emma, curious and cautious, would look. Sometimes she would touch. Each gesture was subtle, each moment quiet, but it built something. Grayson stopped checking his watch during these sessions. He started arriving earlier. He started staying longer. He stopped needing explanations. One morning, he watched as Emma's fingers tapped against the edge of a small tambourine, entirely of her own will. Malin only whispered, "Yes, sweetheart." Grayson, sitting on the floor beside them, looked away to hide his tears. Emma had not spoken, but she was speaking. Her silence was no longer absence. It was pause. Choice. A space between two notes in a song not yet finished. And within that pause, something beautiful had begun to grow. The day began with a golden stillness. Morning sunlight filtered through the gauzy curtains of the sunroom, casting warm slants of light across the floor like quiet promises. Outside, the cherry blossoms had begun to bloom in the garden Elise once tended with such care. The delicate pink petals stirred with the breeze, a silent ballet against the backdrop of Grayson's meticulously kept grounds. But inside the house a different kind of blooming had begun, far subtler and infinitely more profound. Emma had started moving, not often, not consistently, not with fanfare. But she was moving, and more importantly, she was choosing to move. That morning, she had lifted her hand entirely on her own, not in response to a request or a reflex, but out of curiosity. The scarf Malin had been trailing through the air had floated a bit too far from her lap, and without any prompting, Emma's thin arm rose in an awkward, fluttering gesture to catch it. Her fingers missed, brushing the air just beneath the fabric, but the attempt itself had landed with the weight of a miracle. Malin had watched with her breath caught in her chest. She didn't speak. She didn't praise. She simply nodded, as if to say, "I see you." Then she folded her own hands in her lap, letting the scarf fall to the floor, and waited. Emma stared at it for a long time. Then, with painstaking effort, she leaned ever so slightly forward in her chair. The movement was uneven and slow, a battle against a body that had betrayed her for so long, but she reached again, this time with trembling fingers, and caught the edge of the scarf. She brought it to her lap and held it, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Grayson, standing quietly at the door, had to step back into the hallway to steady himself. It wasn't the movement that undid him. It was the look in her eyes. Focused, present, alive. That evening, after the house settled into its usual hush, he found himself standing in front of Elisa's old music cabinet. It had not been opened since the accident. Dust dulled the once polished cherry wood finish. The drawer handles were cold beneath his fingers as he opened the doors and pulled out a small, fabric-bound box that had once held Elisa's favorite sheet music. Inside was a worn booklet, dog-eared and soft with years of turning. Scribbled notes in her lupin handwriting lined the margins, timing cues, reminders, sometimes just little hearts next to favorite passages. Grayson sat down on the floor with the book across his knees and ran his fingers over the notes. Music had always been her language, and now, impossibly, it was becoming Emma's. The next day, Malin brought in something new, a small mat rolled tightly under her arm and a low wooden stool with a velvet cushion. She didn't explain what they were for. She simply unrolled the mat in the center of the sunroom, placed the stool off to the side, and sat cross-legged on the floor. The scarf remained in her lap, unmoving. Grayson watched from the doorway, hands clasped behind his back. "Emma," Malin said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "you don't have to move today. You don't have to try. But if you want, I'll dance." She picked up the scarf and began to move it again, not in large arcs like before, but slowly, carefully, like ripples over water. Her hands painted the air with patient grace, and her body swayed in gentle rhythm, never leaving the mat. Emma's eyes followed. Malin began to hum, a melody so old it barely belonged to this century. Something passed down, sung to babies on porches during long southern summers. There was no pretense to it, only memory and the weight of care woven into every note. Emma shifted. It was subtle. Her shoulders, usually so stiff, softened. Her neck tilted a bit more than usual. Her eyes closed for a few seconds, then reopened, as if she were testing the space around her. Malin lowered the scarf and reached into her tote bag. She pulled out a small bell, simple, round, attached to a soft leather loop, and placed it gently on the mat within Emma's reach. "You don't have to pick it up," she said, almost to herself. "You can just look at it." Emma looked. Then, a minute later, her right hand twitched. Grayson stepped further into the room, unable to stop himself. He crouched beside Emma's wheelchair and touched her arm. "I see you, sweetheart," he said, voice trembling. Emma blinked. Malin continued to hum. The room swelled with silence, not empty, not oppressive, but full of something unspeakable. Hope, maybe, or something deeper. Emma's fingers stretched out slowly. It took time. There was a moment when Grayson thought she would stop, withdraw, but then her palm closed around the bell. It rang. Once. Lightly. Malin stopped humming. She looked up and smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just a soft, soul-deep acknowledgement. "You did that," she whispered. Grayson couldn't speak. He felt something break open inside him, something he hadn't even known was still closed. Emma stared at the bell in her hand. Her face didn't change, but her grip held. That night, Grayson stood on the back porch, watching the stars emerge. The air was cool, but he didn't feel it. His thoughts were with a small silver bell and the girl who had made it sing. He went inside, walked past the staff without a word, and knocked gently on the door of the guest room Malin used during her long days at the house. She opened it with a look of calm, already knowing. "I want to do more," he said. Malin stepped aside, letting him in. He didn't sit, he paced. She's waking up. I see it. I feel it. And it's because of you, what you're doing." Malin tilted her head. "It's because of her." He nodded, swallowed, looked down at his hands. "Then help me build something. A place, a real one. Not this house, not just for her, for others." Malin's expression didn't change, but her breath caught. "I'm not a founder," she said. "You're a healer. I'm a woman with a scarf and a song, and that's what saved my daughter." She didn't answer. Grayson stepped closer. "Malin, I haven't felt anything real in 3 years, not until you, not until this. I don't know what I'm doing, but I know we can't stop here." Malin sat down on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "She's not ready for the world yet. Then we make a world that's ready for her." The words hung between them like something sacred. Later that night, when the house was dark and Emma was asleep, Malin returned to the sunroom alone. She knelt on the mat and spread out her scarf. Then she danced. Not for Emma, not for Grayson, not even for herself, but for all the quiet things in the world that needed to be seen. She danced slowly, fluidly, her arms tracing arcs of grace across the still air. In the hallway, unseen, Grayson watched with tears in his eyes. Emma had made her first movement, but it was Malin who had moved them all. The day of Emma's first step was neither dramatic nor expected. There were no thunderclaps, no flash of divine light through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate. It was a quiet morning, the kind that passed with little ceremony. Sun filtered through the early spring trees, birds chirped in the hedges, and the scent of lilac drifted in through the open windows of the winter garden. Grayson had risen early. He hadn't slept well the night before, his mind restless, his thoughts turning in tight, anxious circles. He had dreamt of Elise again, but not the way he usually did. Not the final image of her lifeless in a hospital bed, not the terrible stillness. This time, she had been laughing, dancing. Her hands had been extended toward someone, toward Emma. But before he could see them touch, he'd woken up. He found himself walking the halls aimlessly that morning, as if the house itself no longer obeyed his sense of direction. When he reached the garden wing, he didn't realize he was headed to the winter room until he was already there. The space had changed, subtly but significantly, in the weeks since Malin's presence had taken root. The cold, echoing room had been softened with fabric and texture, pastel rugs, gauzy curtains, and gentle, warm lighting. A corner had been cleared for movement, a large, open mat spread over the tiled floor, framed by soft cushions and a low wooden railing that wrapped one side. On the far end of the room stood Emma's chair, and, in front of it, on her knees, was Malin. Emma was watching her intently. Malin had her hands outstretched, palms up, the way one offers something sacred. "Today," she said softly, her voice not much louder than the wind outside, "we're going to try something new, but only if you want to. You don't have to do anything. I'm right here." Emma blinked, her face unreadable. Malin reached into her tote bag and withdrew a small pair of flexible braces. She held them up as if asking permission. "These will help support your ankles, that's all. I'll be holding you the entire time." Emma looked at them, then at Malin, then back at the floor. Malin waited. Grayson didn't enter the room. He stood in the archway, his hands clenched at his sides, his breath barely audible. He could feel the tension coiling behind his ribs. Malin moved slowly, speaking in calm, measured tones. "I'm going to put them on now, okay?" Emma didn't nod, but she didn't resist either. Malin secured the braces gently around her feet and ankles, whispering words of encouragement, not like a therapist reciting a motivational script, but like someone preparing a child for her first day in the world. Then she stood and reached for Emma's hands. "I'll lift you, just a little. You don't have to stand. Just lean into me. We'll see how it feels." Emma's fingers rested limply in Malin's for a moment. Then, with a flutter that could have been accidental but wasn't, they closed. Her grip was weak but real. Malin leaned back just slightly, and Emma followed. The girl's legs, long unused for anything more than weightless presence, trembled as her body shifted. Malin moved carefully, lifting under Emma's arms while keeping their foreheads nearly level. "You're doing so well," she whispered. "Breathe with me." Grayson took a step forward, then stopped. His mouth was dry. His heart pounded like it hadn't in years. Emma's knees buckled, and for a second it seemed she would collapse. But Malin adjusted, held her steady. "It's okay," she murmured. "That's just your muscles waking up. They remember more than you think." Emma's face had gone pale, but her jaw was clenched with something that wasn't pain. It was effort, concentration, determination. And then it happened. Her right leg shifted forward, the foot sliding half an inch across the mat, the sole pressed unsteadily against the rug. Then the left followed. Her entire body trembled under the strain, but she was upright, standing. Grayson let out a sound like a gasp, his hand flying to his mouth. Malin didn't speak. She didn't cry out. She only held Emma and whispered, "There you are." Emma's eyes lifted slowly, her lips parted slightly. She looked at Malin, then towards the doorway where her father stood, unmoving. Grayson couldn't breathe. He couldn't speak. He could only fall to his knees, trembling as if the earth had cracked open beneath him. His daughter, his silent, still daughter, was standing. And she was looking at him. He crawled forward, inch by inch, afraid even to stand in case the moment might break like glass. When he reached her, he touched her hand gently. "You're my hero," he whispered. "You hear me? Not the doctors, not me. You." Emma didn't answer, but she smiled, just barely, the smallest lift of the corners of her lips. Malin slowly stepped back, letting the two of them sway slightly together. Grayson reached around her back, steadying her. "Can I dance with you, sweetheart?" he asked, voice breaking. Emma's fingers pressed tighter around his. He stood slowly, helping her lean into him, and for a few glorious seconds they moved. Not a dance by any ballroom definition. Just a small rocking from side to side, but it was more than any waltz he'd ever known. Malin stepped away and watched, her arms folded across her chest, her eyes glistening. She had seen many kinds of breakthroughs in her life, but this was sacred. Later that evening, the house felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. The silence was still there, but it was no longer heavy. It breathed, it shimmered, it gave space. In the study, Grayson poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Malin. "I want to build a place," he said. Malin raised an eyebrow. "You already have one." "Not this. Something for other kids. Kids like Emma, a center." She said nothing. He leaned forward. "You'll run it." She laughed, quietly, but with genuine disbelief. "Grayson, I'm not licensed. I don't have credentials. I've never written a grant, never studied child psychology. I clean, I hum lullabies. And you changed my daughter's life. That was her choice. And it was your presence that gave her the space to choose." She stared at him. "I'll fund it, I'll build it. You decide how it works." Still, she hesitated. "What if I fail?" Grayson smiled. "Then we fail with heart." Malin looked down at her hands, folded on the teacup. She'd never asked for this, never imagined it. But the idea had already taken root in her chest, a place where silence wasn't treated as absence, a place where healing wasn't measured in degrees, a place where children were heard without needing to speak. "A place," she whispered, "where Emma belongs." Grayson nodded. And so the idea took shape faster than Malin had expected. What began as a quiet conversation over tea transformed, almost organically, into a living blueprint. One drawn not in rigid lines or bullet points, but in intentions, memories, and hope. By the end of that first week, Grayson had already cleared a list of properties his development firm had acquired over the years. Some were cold and commercial, uninspiring spaces built for convenience rather than comfort. But one caught Malin's eye. A former wellness retreat nestled in a secluded clearing only 20 minutes from the Whitmore estate. It was not grand, not flashy, but the bones of it were soft. Open courtyards, skylights in every hallway, a ring of trees along its perimeter like gentle sentries. She walked the space twice before speaking. "This one," she said at last, standing in the echo of the largest room, sunlight pouring down through the glass roof above. "This one can be a home." Grayson didn't hesitate. He made the call before they left the building. Permits, renovations, designers, all of it set in motion with a signature. But he deferred every creative decision to her. "I'll build the walls," he said. You decide what happens inside them. Malin had never led anything in her life. She had taken care of children, kept houses clean, whispered stories to sleeping babies. But she had never overseen a project, never hired a team, never been trusted with anything that carried another person's name, let alone their future. Yet, as she walked through each room, fingers brushing faded wallpaper, she saw things. Not as they were, but as they could be. Here, she imagined fabric hanging from the ceiling in slow waves, soft enough to invite wonder. There, a corner filled with drums and chimes, instruments that responded to the lightest touch. Rooms where children could lie on their backs and watch the sky shift above them. Quiet places to be still. Open spaces to move. Grayson watched her work with something approaching awe. He had met CEOs who couldn't lead with half her clarity. She asked questions always. She paused before answering. She didn't speak to impress, but when she did speak, people listened. They assembled a team one by one, not by credentials, though those came, but by presence. A young music therapist who had lost a sibling to illness and understood silence. A retired dance instructor whose grandson was nonverbal and found freedom in rhythm. A former special education teacher who had burned out on bureaucracy, but still believed in magic. Each of them came not because they were promised paychecks, but because they were offered purpose. They called it the Lily Center. Malin didn't know who came up with the name first, but once it was spoken aloud, it stuck. Lily, like the flower that bloomed quietly, almost humbly, yet held strength in every curve. Lily, like the child who had taught them all that listening was its own kind of language. Emma visited the site during construction. The first time, she remained in her chair, fingers clutching the arms tightly as noise and dust filled the air. But on the second visit, with scaffolding cleared and light pouring through the windows, she moved, slowly but deliberately, toward the mat Malin had laid out in the center of what would become the open movement floor. "She feels it," Malin whispered to Grayson. "Even now, she knows." By the second month, the walls had color, warm tones, sage, sand, soft coral, nothing overstimulating, nothing cold. Malin banned fluorescent lights altogether, insisting instead on natural light wherever possible and soft lamps elsewhere. Each hallway carried sound, gentle music that shifted with the time of day, composed by local artists who had volunteered their work after hearing about Emma's story. Grayson offered to hire a branding team. Malin refused. "No logos," she said, "no slogans. This place isn't a product." Instead, she framed handwritten notes from the children they'd begun working with. Scribbles, marks, drawings, each one a signature of voice, even if it came without words. The waiting area was furnished like a living room. No reception desks, no rows of identical chairs, just cushions, woven rugs, and shelves of sensory toys and books. Parents who entered for the first time would often go quiet, not from discomfort, but from something else. Recognition, maybe. Relief. "This place," one mother whispered, "feels like my son is welcome before we even open the door." Emma's progress mirrored the construction. With each day, she moved a little more, said a little more. Her words came in fragments at first, a single syllable, a strained breath, but over time the spaces between them shortened. She had begun to communicate not just with motion, but with intent. Malin remained her center, her anchor. And yet, as the Lily Center took shape, Grayson noticed something else taking root. It wasn't romantic, not yet. It was something older, deeper, a recognition. The way Malin looked at the world had begun to change the way he saw it too. For years, he had lived in a house of silence, believing his wealth and control were all he had left. But now, watching her lay fabric in the corner of a room, or help Emma choose between two bells with near-ceremonial care, he realized that presence, true presence, was something money had never bought him. One night, after a long planning session, they sat on the rooftop of the estate, watching the lights of the city blink in the distance. Emma had fallen asleep inside, curled against a plush pillow with a ribbon still clutched in her hand. "This place," Malin said, her voice low, "is more than I ever imagined." "You built it," Grayson said. "I just wrote the checks." She shook her head. "You gave me something I didn't know I was waiting for." He looked at her then, fully, not as Emma's nanny, not as a partner in this project, but as a woman who had somehow carried his family back to life. "What's that?" he asked. "A place to belong." The moment hung between them like breath before a song. Later that week, they hosted their first community session. No fanfare, no ribbon cutting, just a handful of families invited for a trial run. Emma led them in. She walked, not steadily, not without a cane, but upright, into the central room, and stood at its heart as Malin turned on the music. Children gathered slowly, cautiously, watching her. Some were in chairs, some clutching parents' hands, some staring at the ceiling. Emma lifted a scarf, twirled it once in the air, then passed it to the child nearest her. And just like that, the circle began. Movement, sound, silence that was no longer emptiness, but possibility. Parents watched through the glass, many with hands over their mouths, unable to speak. Grayson stood with them, one hand pressed to the glass, his eyes never leaving his daughter. "She's not following," someone whispered behind him. "She's leading." He smiled, not turning. "Yes, she is." That night, Malin walked through the empty halls, barefoot, carrying a candle as she checked each room. It had become a ritual, quietly blessing each space with intention before locking the doors. In one room, she paused. The floor still smelled faintly of new varnish, and the walls bore fingerprints from the children who had explored it earlier that day. She sat down on a cushion and closed her eyes. "I never thought I'd come this far," she said aloud, to no one in particular. In the silence, she thought of all the children she'd held over the years, all the families who had trusted her with their most precious people. But this was different. Here, she had not just been given a task, she had been given a legacy, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a guest in someone else's story. She felt like its author. The Lilly Center opened its doors quietly the next week. No press release, no investors with champagne. Just the sound of laughter echoing through its halls and the soft ring of a bell in Emma's hand. They had built a house that listened. And in that listening, the world began to change. There are moments in life so quietly transformative that no one thinks to name them until much later. They arrive not with trumpets, but with whispers. They settle into the edges of routine and stitch themselves into the fabric of the everyday until suddenly, without warning, the world feels different. It was that way with Emma. The Lilly Center had been open for 3 months. Families came and went each day, some driving for hours, others arriving by bus or by foot, their children carried in their arms or wheeled beside them. There were no uniforms, no clocks on the walls. Children played, explored, sang, or simply watched. No one was rushed. No one was measured. Emma had become a fixture in the main studio, a quiet force around whom others gravitated. She spoke more now, carefully, not fluently, but with intention. Each word felt like a small jewel she'd pulled from deep water. She walked every morning from the car to the center's doors, her steps slow but steady, her cane now a companion rather than a crutch. But what drew people to her most wasn't her recovery, but her presence. She noticed things, the way a child paused before touching a drum, the sound of a breath caught in fear or joy. She was still only 10 years old, but she carried something ancient in her silence, a depth born not of age, but of what she had endured. Malin watched it all from the periphery, always present but never imposing. She had become the center's living spirit, moving between rooms with the grace of someone who knew how to listen to air. She remembered every child's name, their preferences, the colors that frightened them, the songs that calmed them. When she entered a space, children turned without fear. They opened, not because she asked, but because she waited. Grayson spent more time at the center than he'd expected. At first, he'd come as an observer, cautious and protective. Then, as Emma's steps grew stronger, he came as a father in awe. And slowly, without even realizing it, he became something more. He began to help, carrying boxes, greeting new families, sitting with overwhelmed parents. He no longer wore suits. His days of stockholder meetings and boardrooms had given way to jeans and rolled sleeves, to floor mats and hand drums, to laughter that shook the dust from the parts of him he'd long thought dead. One afternoon, during a music session, Malin entered the central room to find Grayson on the floor, surrounded by children. He held a small tambourine in his lap, and a boy with cerebral palsy was tapping its edge with a soft mallet. Grayson wasn't guiding, he wasn't teaching, he was simply there, shoulder to shoulder, eye to eye. She watched from the doorway, smiling. It had been a long road for him, for all of them. That evening, as they locked the doors, Malin lingered in the front garden. The cherry trees were in bloom again, just as they had been the first time she'd entered the Whitmore estate. The memory of that day felt like a life ago, before Emma's voice, before Grayson's thawing, before the rhythm of music and movement had filled their lives. Grayson joined her without speaking. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the breeze rustle through the branches. "She danced today," he said finally. Malin turned to him, eyebrows raised. "Emma," he continued, "in the studio, with her arms, not guided, not prompted, just moved." Malin's hand flew to her chest. "What song?" "Something one of the kids made up, just a loop on the keyboard, but it moved her." They stood there, soaking in the joy of it, saying nothing more. A few days later, Grayson approached Malin with a request. "I want to host something here," he said. "Not a fundraiser, not press, just something for the kids, for the families." "A celebration?" she asked. He nodded. "A night of light, music, movement, laughter, a thank you." Malin's eyes sparkled. "Then let's make it beautiful." They spent the next 2 weeks preparing. Nothing extravagant, just intention. Fabric was hung across the ceilings in flowing colors. Paper lanterns were strung through the trees. Children painted their own invitations with brushstrokes and thumbprints. No one was required to attend. No one was asked to perform. It was simply a gathering, a soft, glowing evening to honor everything they had built together. The night arrived with warm air and a sky full of stars. Families arrived in waves, children dressed in costumes of their choosing, some in capes, others in sparkles or pajamas. There were drums in the courtyard, ribbon sticks in the garden, and music floating through every hallway. Emma sat with Malin under a tree as other children danced. She wore a simple white dress, and a silk ribbon tied around her wrist trailed in the breeze. She watched for a while, quiet but content. Then a song began to play. Something soft and lilting, the kind of melody that tugged gently at the heart without asking too much of it. Without a word, Emma stood. Malin watched, her breath catching. Grayson stepped closer, his heart in his throat. Emma moved into the courtyard and raised her arms. She swayed slowly, her ribbon catching the air. Children paused, drawn toward her as if by gravity. One by one, they joined, some spinning, some simply rocking in place. No choreography, no performance, just shared presence. Malin stepped to the edge of the light, tears in her eyes. Grayson took her hand. "This," he said, his voice trembling, "is what healing looks like." Malin didn't answer. She couldn't. The words were too small. Emma's eyes met hers across the courtyard, and for the first time she spoke clearly, her voice ringing over the music like the bell she once held in silence. "Come dance with me." Malin stepped forward, and there, under a canopy of stars and lanterns, surrounded by laughter and light, they danced. It was not perfect. Emma stumbled. Malin guided. Grayson joined, awkward and unsure. Children laughed. Parents wept. But it was real. It was sacred. The dance was not just Emma's victory. It was Malin's, too, and Grayson's, and every child who had ever been told they were broken, every family who had been made to feel they were alone. As the music faded, Emma collapsed gently into Malin's arms, exhausted but radiant. "I did it," she whispered. "You did," Malin replied, holding her close. Later that night, as the center emptied and lanterns flickered out one by one, Grayson stood in the quiet, looking out over the courtyard. He thought of Elise, of the daughter they had made, of the life he had nearly let slip into silence. Malin stepped beside him. "She would be proud," she said. "She is," he answered. Emma slept in the nursery upstairs, ribbon still tied to her wrist. They stood together, not speaking, just breathing. The Lily Center glowed behind them, and the world, once so full of quiet sorrow, now hummed with the soft, steady rhythm of light. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out the next video and explore others on the channel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it.